Welcome to Flippening, the first and original podcast for full-time, professional, and institutional crypto investors. I'm your host, Clay Collins. Each week, we discuss the cryptocurrency economy, new investment strategies for maximizing returns, and stories from the front lines of financial disruption. Go to flippening.com to join our newsletter for cryptocurrency investors and find out just why this podcast is called Flippening.
Clay Collins is the CEO of Nomics. All opinions expressed by Clay and podcast guests are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinion of Nomics or any other company. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions.
Welcome to the first installment of our two-part series on the history of crypto exchanges. I'm joined by Nathaniel Whittemore, who is a freelance crypto communications strategist and curator of Long Read Sunday on Twitter. This conversation is part of a larger series we're doing on crypto exchanges. As part of the series, we've already interviewed Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao, also known as CZ, Binance CFO Wei Zhu, Ivan Poon from Switcheo, Alex Wern from IDEX, and Sam Bankman-Fried from FTX. They're also the creators of the FTT token, and John Jansen from Deribit. Upcoming interviews that are part of the series include an interview with the CEO of Liquid and the founders of 0x. As a side note, if you run a top 50 exchange by volume, I want to speak with you as part of the series. Please reach out to set that up if you're interested. Now for a bit of background on this episode and this content. Here goes. For the past few years, I've done a lot of thinking about exchanges, exchange data, and how to combat exchange spam. On top of this, all the data from Nomics.com comes directly from crypto exchanges or is derived from exchange data. Because of this, we interface with exchange businesses more than just about any other kind of business. Nathaniel and I are teaming up to write an article about the history of crypto exchanges, and this conversation reveals some of the things we've learned while writing this article. In this two-part series, we explore the main ideas from this article that we're writing, and we share our understanding of how cryptocurrency exchanges and the crypto exchange ecosystem has evolved over time. This conversation is broken up into 5 chapters. In chapter 1, we discuss the prehistory of Bitcoin and how regulation from that era still affects us today. In chapter 2, we explore the first crypto exchange that launched only a year after Bitcoin went live. In chapter 3, we dive into the Mt. Gox story and the fallout caused by that hack. In chapter 4, we discuss the rise of ICOs and how this fed into the ascendancy of Binance. Finally, in chapter 5, we close our conversation by exploring current trends in the crypto exchange ecosystem. In this episode, which you're listening to right now, we'll cover chapters 1 through 3. In the following episode, which comes out next week, we'll cover chapters 4 through 5. We'll get right to the content in just a second, but before we get started, I'd like to pause for a moment to tell you that this episode is brought to you by the good folks at Nexo. Here's a word from them. Nexo is the only lender offering instant crypto credit lines, which let you use digital assets as collateral to get cash in 45 fiat currencies and stablecoins. Nexo is also a strategic partner of exchanges, OTC desks, and crypto funds through its portfolio of structured financial products. Institutional counterparties can earn up to 8% annually on their idle stablecoins, enter into asset swap agreements, or directly borrow crypto. Individuals can also park their cash in stablecoins in a Nexo interest earning account and get an annual return of 8%. What's more, interest is paid out daily and you can add or withdraw funds at any time. So if you're looking to borrow, lend, or swap digital assets, Nexo is your go-to partner. Definitely explore nexo.io, or if you're an institution, you can reach out to them at institutions@nexo.io. This episode is also brought to you by the Nomics API and CSV data export service. If you need an enterprise-grade crypto market data API for your fund, smart contract, or app, or if you need historical CSV dumps of trading data or crypto market cap data from top exchanges or even obscure ones, then consider trying out the Nomics API or our historical data export service. Our cryptocurrency API enables programmatic access to clean, normalized, and gapless primary source trade data across a number of cryptocurrency exchanges. Instead of having to integrate with multiple exchange APIs of varying quality, you can get everything through one screaming fast fire hose. And if you'd like to order historical cryptocurrency market data as CSV exports from top exchanges, email us at sales@nomics.com. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Here's part one of my conversation with Nathaniel Whittemore. Enjoy. It strikes me that when talking to investors, often in the space, they'll describe some kind of thesis around decentralization or whatever their thesis is. Sometimes they're fairly sophisticated. But at the end of the day, people are really just investing in tokens or exchanges. Those are really the two businesses or two investment types. Is they're going to acquire some percentage of the tokens from a token project, or they're going to own part of an exchange, and hopefully that'll be profitable. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of investable business types that kind of work at scale, or, where you can generate, VC type returns. But exchanges seem to be the most prominent one. Every other day I'm hearing about an investment in another exchange. What are your thoughts on kind of exchanges? Like, before we started this historical deep dive, what was your relationship to exchanges other than, perhaps a user?
If you look at across the crypto industry, there are really two categories of iconic brands. One is the tokens themselves, and the second is exchanges. What makes this market fascinating, what makes this industry rather fascinating, is that you have the unbelievable belief and vision of the future requirements of traditional private startups, but they are fueled by a public market style speculative behavior. And so you have this weird mixture of true believers and hodlers, investing in these assets. But then you also have just a totally kind of agnostic, basically, speculators and investors who are there to make a profit. And somehow that's the kind of that weird mix is what drives things and what provides fuel and liquidity and space for creation to happen. And so exchanges have always been just incredibly integral to this industry from when the industry was literally just Bitcoin, because they make the business model of belief work for both sides of that, right? For the speculators who provide that influx of capital necessary to get to the next milestone or the next wave, whether it's a technical milestone or more usually a kind of a social and belief milestone, or whether it's a place for those true believers to live in the real world and be able to move their money around when they need to as well. So in some ways, the story of this industry is, you can write it in a couple different ways, but one of them, and one of, I think, in some ways, the most important one, is the history of exchanges. What have they represented? What services have they provided? What is the lever for growth? What has the perception of them been? How do they relate to the larger financial system? How do they relate to regulators? It's kind of been ground zero for the broader idea of crypto assets in each case. In some ways, trying to write a history or just think through a history of exchanges is thinking through a history of the whole space just from a particular vantage point.
Also worth noting that exchanges for most people are the onboarding institutions into the cryptosphere. I mean, you can read a bunch of stuff, you can go to meetups, but most people don't know someone who's going to pay them in crypto, unless it's sort of like weird illicit activities done across borders online. Like, there's only a handful of things that could be. But for the most part, if you decide that you would like to have a stake in this larger ecosystem, for me, it was going to Coinbase. And that was the fiat on-ramp. And they not only allowed me to purchase my first Bitcoin, but they, for a very long time, were the custodian for me. Not only, I think, do exchanges onboard people into this whole ecosystem, but they're also institutions that most holders or hodlers who don't have hardware wallets or don't have a Casa node, they're very vulnerable to them, because if they do get hacked, they're kind of out of luck. And for the vast majority of people who do own a crypto asset, it probably does make more sense to hold those assets in a respected, regulated exchange versus holding it themselves. So I think in a lot of ways, the story of exchanges, it really is the story of crypto assets post Satoshi Nakamoto.
It's where everyone who walks in the door, in most cases, to your point, where their individual story connects to the larger story, right? I mean, they literally are the exchange. That is the point where they come in. So yeah, again, it's really fascinating. And their relationships with customers has kind of followed and changed, and as the customer base has changed as well. So there's this whole other dimension where exchanges reflect the changes in the user base in terms of what they expect and what they understand and what they're looking for and what they're trying to buy and how they're trying to buy.
Crypto exchanges, there's a lot of drawbacks versus traditional stock exchanges, for example, but there's a lot more that they do as well. For example, they, in some cases, allow you to earn interest on crypto assets held there. Like Coinbase announced that, and Binance has been doing that for a while. They allow you to stake. They custody the assets, which is not something that traditional sort of old school financial institution exchanges have allowed you to do. Some of them provide loans and lending. It's kind of interesting when we talk about exchanges. It can be everything from something like Coinbase Pro, which is a traditional financial institution exchange, to something that's a lot more involved. And so we're seeing sort of this spectrum emerge of kind of around value-added custody, right? If an exchange has assets, has your assets, there's a lot of services that they can provide to you once they hold those assets that traditional exchanges haven't been able to provide because there is no custody. I think they have the potential to be the most powerful institutions in the space, really.
In some ways, they already are. They're certainly the seat of a huge amount of innovation. I mean, to your point, the business model innovation coming out of exchanges is so unbelievably breathtakingly quick, right? Like if you look just since the middle of 2017, which we're really talking about 26, 27 months, the number of different shifts in terms of how exchanges make money, what they do, what they enable relative to the rest of the space. I mean, we're talking 3, 4, 5 significant changes, often in a single business, right? Like you had in 2017, between the middle of 2017 and the beginning of 2018, an exchange become the fastest growing company, private company in history. And moreover, the fastest growing profitable unicorn in history, right? There's plenty of companies that have become unicorns on the basis of valuation. Binance actually was a profitable unicorn inside the span of like 6 months. And if they had just stopped there, they would likely have been totally relegated in some ways. I mean, there's this weird contrast between, on the one hand, there are more network effects in an exchange business than in many other types of businesses because of the value of liquidity and the security and all that sort of stuff. However, if you look at the successive patterns of who's had the biggest volume at any given time, holding aside things like the wash trading and kind of fraudulent volume that we talk about a lot as well, it just shifts. It's shifted so quickly, and it's this ever-changing landscape. And even with such clear leaders in some ways, like a Binance, there is no guarantee that even 6 months from now, they'll be the leader in the same way. And so it creates this incredible cauldron for just mandated innovation in some ways. Now, at the same time, you have a huge part of the industry that's just filling in gaps and providing, fiat on-ramps in particular jurisdictions, or is trying to differentiate on one point. And, obviously we see a landscape of, hundreds of exchanges, but that competition at the top to really figure out what the market needs next and to provide that and to even push the market in some ways, not to just ask what it needs, but say, hey, you should have this. It makes it extra interesting.
In addition to that huge push to innovate or at least evolve, I don't know how many of these ideas are like sort of net new to the space, but certainly it requires execution, and the exchanges that have been able to execute the fastest while maintaining security standards have absolutely crushed it. But in addition to that, we've seen a lot of really interesting developments from the space around jurisdictional arbitrage, centralized versus decentralized. One might argue that Binance itself is a stateless entity. They're really not located in one single place, but then they have all these fiat on-ramp businesses that are located everywhere. So where is that business located? I think they've pushed the boundaries in just so many different ways. And it's one of the most fascinating sort of areas of business right now, because it is custody, it is banking, it is exchange, it is a whole bunch of other things combined with statelessness, issuing currencies. It's like the privatization of, the banking systems that have taken decades to evolve, at least here in the United States. I can't wait to see what comes of that.
I would argue that when Harvard Business Study does case studies of Binance, it won't just be about what they did in crypto. It'd be about them as an organizational structure in terms of their willingness to actually move and play the regulatory arbitrage game in a way that hasn't been done on that scale, right? They have moved 5 times their headquarters, I think. So they started in Hong Kong and then they moved to, I believe it was Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, Cayman Islands, and then finally Malta. And then meanwhile, no one knows where their servers are. So that's a whole different area. And on top of that, they're working on something like 9 different locally regulated fiat on-ramp exchanges. So like Uganda, Jersey, Singapore, Malta, South Korea, Argentina, Russia, Turkey, Bermuda, Liechtenstein. Like those are all going to be their...
All of that. And they've issued their own crypto asset, and which in and of itself isn't that innovative, but then they turn that into the basis for Binance Dex, which is designed to be the evil twin that obsoletes everything else they're doing, which is in and of itself pretty crazy that you would invent the evil twin meant to destroy you.
I was just rewatching a clip from CoinDesk or from Invest New York last year. And it was Andrew Ross Sorkin in conversation with Mohammed Ibrahim. And he was basically talking about, Andrew Ross Sorkin said something to the effect of like, if it's interesting technology, why wouldn't people just, why wouldn't Visa or MasterCard or whatever just do their own thing and kind of take the tech and ignore everything else? And he said, basically his answer was because companies don't have the capacity to self-disrupt. And that's, 99 times out of 100 or maybe 999 times out of 1,000. I think that's true. And what you're seeing with a company like Binance is it's not only is it showing the capacity to self-disrupt, it is playing out multiple lines of potential self-disruption to be prepared for whichever one is relevant for the market.
It's a pretty gutsy position to say that if someone's going to disrupt me, it's going to be me. And, you don't see Hyatt hotels inventing Airbnb. You don't see taxi companies for the most part inventing Uber. It's a pretty rare thing. I think maybe to some extent, Apple tried to cannibalize the iPod which was their, an incredibly successful product that in a lot of ways brought them out of the doldrums and of slow growth. But, they disrupt that with the phone. Maybe that's an example, but there just aren't a lot of examples of businesses doing this and, doing it with gusto and conviction and then doing it successfully. Let's kick off chapter 1 or historical wave 1, which is about the prehistory of Bitcoin.
So I was a history major in college. I think for me, it's not an accident that in my professional life, when I'm working with companies on narratives, I'm looking for big patterns because history is a lot about big patterns that give way to one another and influence one another. And a lot of the study of history is trying to look at what actually happened and how it influenced the pattern. And I think what makes it different maybe than some other social science disciplines is that it tries, although not always successfully, to do that without just mapping its own pre-existing set of kind of beliefs or categorizations onto the world. And so going back and looking at kind of the history of exchanges, what's interesting to me is how these kind of waves and patterns give way to one another. And in some ways, I see that accelerating now. The more money, the more people come into the industry. I think those waves and patterns of disruption are happening even more frequently. And sometimes, as we were just discussing with Binance, within the context of a single company. But so one of the things that's really fascinating is when you go back and look at the kind of the history of exchanges in the same way that there was a prehistory to Bitcoin, right? Like for a lot of us, Bitcoin was, the white paper and then Chancellor on the brink of a second bailout. And that's when it started. But there was, of course, this huge lineage of people experimenting with electronic currencies and digital currencies in advance. So too, obviously, were there people who were giving those currencies or creating a mechanism for people to buy them. And so if you go back, though, and look, a lot of the story of those cryptocurrencies reads like the earliest and most persistent critiques of the crypto industry today, right? So one of the big electronic currencies from the 90s and the aughts, I guess, the 2000s, was e-gold, right? Which theoretically was an electronic currency that was backed by gold that was stored in vaults in London and Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other places, theoretically. They were trying to kind of play out a lot of the same ideas as when Bitcoin hit in terms of there being a separation between the protocol or the asset that was e-gold and the companies that are built around to allow people to interact with e-gold. But if you read that history, it is just law enforcement after law enforcement after law enforcement, right? So in 2004, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission shut down like 3 different e-currency sites for operating without a financial license. This is a common thread, right? Money transmitter licenses, anti-fraud, not participating in anti-fraud stuff. In 2006, FBI raids Gold Age, which was kind of probably the most high-profile version of this in the US, and later come out that something like 4 million of the 36 million that had flowed through the system was part of some big money laundering scheme. And if you actually read the statements from back then, you could take them out of context and it sounds like our president talking about this, right? So here's a quote. So the advent of new electronic currency systems increases the risk that criminals and possibly terrorists will exploit these systems to launder money and transfer funds globally to avoid law enforcement scrutiny and circumvent banking regulations and reporting. That was from 2007. It was the FBI Cyber Division. By the way, the guy who started Gold Age and who got 5 years probation for it went on to start Liberty Reserve, which it had its own proprietary currency. Think of it almost like a proto-Tether in some ways, although not necessarily a lot less professionalized than Tether. But Liberty Reserve was in the earliest crypto exchanges used as a payment processor, kind of a payment on-ramp to get your money off of the exchanges after PayPal. PayPal was used at first, but then it pretty quickly shut all these exchanges down in 2010 and 2011.
Hey, I wanted to pause for a second to let you know that this episode of the Flippening Podcast is brought to you by Nexo. Here's a word from them. Nexo is the only lender offering instant crypto credit lines, which let you use digital assets as collateral to get cash in 45 fiat currencies and stablecoins. Nexo is also a strategic partner of exchanges, OTC desks, and crypto funds through its portfolio of structured financial products. Institutional counterparties can earn up to 8% annually on their idle stablecoins, enter into asset swap agreements, or directly borrow crypto. Individuals also can park their cash and stablecoins in a Nexo interest-earning account to get an annual rate of return of 8%. What's more, interest is paid out daily, and you can add or withdraw funds at any time. So if you are looking to borrow, lend, or swap digital assets, Nexo is your go-to partner. Definitely explore Nexo.io or reach out to them at institutions@nexo.io. Okay, back to the show.
Liberty Reserve was started by the same folks as Gold Age. And the guy, Arthur Budovsky-Belenchuk, it was shut down in 2013. He was arrested in 2016. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years. The early story of these exchanges was, whatever the case, I'm sure that there was a huge amount of excitement. We know there was a huge amount of legitimate belief and excitement because the embers of those things got put into what we now know as Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency industry. But a lot of the early, let's call it speculative behavior for those was that criminal element, which would find itself moving on into the earliest exchanges in Bitcoin as well.
It's almost like, the government, as long as there is a single throat to choke, will require regulation and all kinds of compliance. But the second that doesn't exist, right? If something becomes sufficiently decentralized, then they seem fine just throwing up their hands and letting certain kind of behaviors and practices persist. Like they're not trying to shut down Bitcoin. At this point, they probably can't. But from the very beginning, they weren't trying to regulate it simply because they couldn't, right? There's no door to knock on. And in a lot of ways, it feels like all of this centralized infrastructure that was what the creators of Bitcoin were rebelling against. We have that in abundance today. But hopefully it's just bootstrapping the decentralized version of all these services that are built on top of it right now. And that's the future that awaits us. Hopefully, we'll see.
I think that you're getting into an interesting point, which is a common thread. So if you go back and look at Bitcoin Talk, so after this conviction happened in 2016 on Bitcoin Talk, there were a number of threads like what makes Liberty Reserve different from Bitcoin? And a lot of the answer had to do with the centralization and the single point of failure. Now, there's a million other reasons too, right? The fact that Bitcoin solved double spend problem and all these sort of things, right? Like they're substantively different as well. However, functionally, practically, that was one of the biggest differences, right? I mean, and this joke is made every day on Twitter, right? Like last week, Zuckerberg said that he agreed that he was going to come testify before Congress on October 23rd. And Rhythm Trader, who's an excellent literary meme artist in the Bitcoin space, said the CEO of Bitcoin, meanwhile, could not be reached to answer his invitation. And you see that joke over and over and over again. But I do think there's another important point that you're making too, which is that the exchanges have this strange role because they represent the tension between a decentralized, permissionless, kind of unstoppable, uncensorable force that cryptocurrencies, or at least some cryptocurrencies, bring into the world. They enable that on the one hand. On the other hand, they're the tool that de-risks that through regulation for governments, right? You can functionally kill a cryptocurrency by making people unable to do anything with it. And so it makes it less scary. There is a tension. I mean, people have pointed out the tension before. There is hero worship of CZ, and it's hard not to, especially if you're the type of person who's like fascinated by business. Just from the standpoint of pure executional capacity, it's hard not to be impressed. But at the same time, the question that is ever present, or needs to be at least in the Bitcoin and in the crypto space, is what should the nature of power be? How much power should any one person or any one institution have? What is the resilience of the system when it's organized around institutions that are ultimately single points of failure, even if they're big, complex, successful, and seem to be impervious to kind of stumble and fall? So yeah, it's pretty fascinating. We were already seeing some of those tensions around points of failure from the early days before even Bitcoin was launched.
Let's move to chapter 2, aka historical wave 2, which is about the first real crypto exchange.
The original exchanges, in a lot of ways, were people talking on Bitcoin Talk, and there was, tons of people used eBay. They used Craigslist, to your point. And I think it is cool, actually, in a lot of ways, that is, no matter how big these exchanges get, that continues to be a way that people exchange Bitcoin. One, there's the whole dimension of how it's almost entirely over the counter in China because of the ban on exchanges since 2017.
Hey, this is Clay cutting in from the editor's booth to shed some light on the Chinese ban of crypto exchanges. In September of 2018, China banned initial coin offerings. This ICO regulation also restricted the activity of cryptocurrency exchanges domiciled in mainland China. Because of this ban, many crypto exchanges, for example, Binance, moved out of China to preserve their businesses. Okay, back to the show.
That P2P base case has remained. In some ways, each of these phases has like an iconic, at least one really iconic brand or exchange. And that was obviously for the early days was Mt. Gox, right? The early story of Bitcoin exchanges that most people would reference back to was Gox. But that wasn't actually the kind of widely accepted first exchange. That was an exchange called Bitcoin Market. On January 15th, 2010, a member of Bitcoin Talk named DW Dollar, he says, "Hi, everyone. I'm in the process of building an exchange. I have big plans for it, but I still have a lot of work to do. It will be a real market where people will be able to buy and sell Bitcoins with each other. In the coming weeks, I should have a website with a basic framework set up. Please bear with me." That was the first message about an exchange back on Bitcoin Talk. And I love that. I actually tweeted it out the other day because it says, "I have big plans for it, but I still have a lot of work to do," which I feel like is the whole industry to this day. Back in this day, it was literally just like, holy, like how do we make this work? And two, how do we make sure it is not completely broken constantly? How do we make sure that people don't just lose their money? And at the same time, how do we deal with this incredible volatility, right? So about a year later, PayPal was removed from the exchange. They stopped being able to use PayPal. That same day, someone on the forum was writing and they said, "This market is going nuts. Yesterday, I saw a guy selling Bitcoin on eBay for $20. I thought he wouldn't sell any right away, sold all 30 to 4 different bidders in 12 hours. Now this morning, I see bitcoinmarket.com at $23.99. I'm usually a buy and hold kind of guy, but this rapid growth is freaking me out. I only own 75 BTC, but I feel like the rich guy." So that's from mid 2011. The early days, it was just like literally people watching this. By the way, I think this is a nice little segue for whenever someone says that Bitcoin was the easiest trade in the world, all you had to do is be around early enough to know. Bull. And here's why, because this guy is like, you have a thing that you bought for $1 that someone says worth is 20, and now you've got 75 of them. It's like, you know what? I got to treat my girl to whatever. I'll sell half of them. I mean, I think about this all the time because I was advising a company in San Francisco that went through Y Combinator, the same class as Coinbase in 2012. And every founder got a Bitcoin in their Coinbase wallet or whatever. And I ignored it. I didn't really pay that much attention to it. I spent a little bit of time with it. I started subscribing to CoinDesk and literally as soon as it launched in 2013. I was going back through the emails. but it's just never like paid attention enough. And there's a huge number of reasons for that. But anyways, I think that it's when we go back and look at how people felt the same way that we felt, in 2017 when things were going crazy with the ICO market, in 2011 when it's going from, 20 to $24 to 30 to back down to like 17, like there's always volatility has always been the background.
Okay, let's transition to chapter 3 or wave 3, which is about Mt. Gox.
Bitcoin market was kind of the first to kick this off, but it's really Mt. Gox that captured everyone's imagination. So Gox is a fascinating history. I mean, I think most people are kind of somewhat familiar with the story and the fallout from the hack. So Mt. Gox was the domain was originally registered in 2007 by Jed McCaleb, obviously known for Ripple and now for Stellar. But he registered the domain in 2007 as the Magic the Gathering online exchange. So it was originally a place to buy and sell Magic cards, which is super interesting. There's lots of weird connections to Magic the Gathering and crypto, but that's a whole different podcast. It became what we know it as now in July of 2010. That's when it actually launched. But importantly, it was really like the next year. So it was still being run by Jed when it started in July of 2010. But then in March of 2011, it was sold to Mark Karpels, who's a French citizen. And kind of Mark's story is the one that's been the most wrapped up with Gox. Actually, let me put a little bit of context too of just how early this is, right? So we're talking about all these things. Bitcoin didn't reach a $1 billion market cap until March of 2013. We're talking about 2 years before that. For more context, Bitcoin didn't reach a market cap of 1 million till November 6th of 2010. And it didn't reach $1 per Bitcoin until February 9th of 2011. So that's really like how crazy early we are. Another thing that happened in early 2011 is Silk Road opens. And I think in some ways the Silk Road story is kind of dragging out that prehistory wrapped up in the exchange story, right? Because exchanges were used to move money in and out that was then moved to Silk Road. And so it was really interesting though. If you look at that early period in 2011, it is just such a land grab, right? And it's really clear. If we go back to this idea of what did an exchange do to grow at a given point? Well, back then it did a couple of things. One, it existed. That was step one, because there weren't that many that were able to do this and willing to do it and could exist. Two, it was basically about how do I provide this for a different market? End of March, this is 2011, Bitcoin opens. End of March 2011, Bitcoin Brazil opens. April, bitmarket.eu opens. Like, so it's like you see all of the kind of global people who are watching what's going on with Bitcoin market and then Gox start to register their own domains. But really, so the part one and part two they existed and then they maybe found their own kind of like somewhat geographically relevant or kind of fiat denominated relevance. But then the second thing that they tried to do is not lose money and not be victim to hacks. And it was crazy. Like before most of us knew that this even existed, they had come and gone, right? So in early 2012, we already saw the number 2 exchange in the US, TradeHill, had shut down because it was worried about regulatory issues. In May, the third biggest exchange in the US is hacked. I mean, really, like if you look at this history, mostly it's just the story of people losing money because hackers did something. Anyways, throughout this time, again, there's a huge number of exchanges and different people were doing different things on them, but Mt. Gox was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the leader. And at peak, it handled somewhere between 70 and 80% of all Bitcoin transactions, which is unfathomably more than any single exchange now, obviously. And so obviously the bankruptcy and the shutdown and all that has been well profiled. And, Peter McCormick did an entire 6-part, 7-part podcast series on this, right? I mean, books have been written and will be written about this. But basically, February, March 2014, it came out, and the it came out part is really important, that something like 850 Bitcoin that were worth about 473 million at the time, more than 3 billion now, which was 7% of all Bitcoins at the time, had disappeared. They were just gone. The problem was 2 things. One, I guess that's a pretty evident problem, but the additional problems were 2 things. The first was that it kind of had known about this something like 8 months before it admitted it publicly. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is that this had been happening since basically the fall of 2011. From within months of Mark Karpels taking over of Gox, the hack happened. Effectively, someone was able to access the wallets and then they had a spigot on where this is a quote from kind of the research that came out after. Basically, from when the hack happened for the next 2 years, in 9 out of 10 instances, coins on Gox were being stolen as soon as they came in. So it was just literally, they were just gone, which is extra crazy to think about. That 473 million in value. The estimates of what the hackers actually made away with is more like $20 million because they were sold literally instantly. Anyways, the Gox story is ongoing to this day. I guess the one important other detail, just for this is the super abbreviated, like go listen to Peter's podcast or go read about it more. But they were able to discover 200,000 Bitcoins in a wallet that had been untouched for like 3 years. And so of that 850 that were just gone, evaporated into nowhere, 200,000 were suddenly back. So the company went into bankruptcy protection, and Mark Karbles spent a year in jail. He was arrested for something different. He was arrested for manipulating data within the system, which is a whole different thing within this, because that's still ongoing. So we don't even have to comment on that. But the interesting thing is that there are just these 200,000 Bitcoins sitting there right now. And we're dealing now with Japanese bankruptcy law, which basically would be effectively what would happen, I think. And feel free to scream at me in the comments if I've got the substance of this wrong. But I think this is the gist of it, is that in Japanese bankruptcy law, creditors were only able to claim the cash value of the Bitcoins, not the Bitcoin value. So if they were paid back, they would be paid back in the cash value. Problem is, obviously, that 200,000 Bitcoins now are worth a hell of a lot more than the creditors who have come in. And based on Japanese bankruptcy law, what was left would go to Karpels, who was basically the biggest and only, effectively one of the only shareholders. So he would have this huge windfall. And he doesn't want that because he's like, my life is already ruined. I would have even more death threats than I have now. So there's this whole crazy plan. Like, it's one of the first times in history that a company has gone bankrupt, but the assets that it has on its balance sheet have accrued so much value in the interim that it would make money for the people who put it into bankruptcy. And so it's going through this whole process now. They're trying to basically engineer what they're calling a civil rehabilitation, where they bring it back so that they can distribute the assets. But it's crazy, right? I mean, to this day, it casts a shadow on the industry. Bitcoin was in a bear market for like 2 years after the discovery of the Mt. Gox hack, right? For some people, it was still, what Bitcoin is associated with, right up there with the Silk Road. And it really wasn't in some ways until the altcoin movement began and Ethereum started to become a thing. And this idea of smart contracts enabling the easy production of new tokens became a thing, that a whole new wave of exchanges who are offering something kind of fundamentally different and coming at this from a different way started to rise to prominence. Now, of course, they were building, right? Like Kraken was around this whole time. Kraken even at one point was trying to help Mt. Gox solve it before it just kind of peeled off and was like, no thanks, guys. Jesse Powell was there really early. And you had Poloniex and you had Bitstamp and all these companies. They were starting around the same time, 2013, 2014. But again, I think if you look at the big successive waves of history and what happened next, there was a long incubatory period before kind of a new type of exchange and a new type of exchange activity storms onto the scene in 2017.
A few things stand out. One, I think you were spot on when you said that it was really hard to hang on to Bitcoin if you got it early. For one, say you bought something at 50 cents or $1, you see it go to 200. Your reference point is just so low, you're probably incredulous. You might sell it. Two, if you don't sell it, there's a good chance that it might be stored in Mt. Gox or in one of any other number of exchanges where it could have been taken from you, hacked, stolen. In addition, you might have had either a paper wallet or gone the manual route and created a private and public key pair, and maybe you lost the hard drive. But there were a lot of things separating Bitcoin from people, or there have been along the way. I've read an analysis saying, I believe it is between 3 and 4 million Bitcoin have been lost forever. At least it appears that way based on on-chain analysis. And that strikes me as pretty accurate. Like that is believable to me. I think the other thing, before we get into kind of Ethereum and the amazing amount of creativity and financial engineering and, both good and bad that sort of stemmed from that, both in terms of different token types and ERC20 tokens, and also the ecosystem that allowed for the first decentralized exchanges to pop up. But we should talk a little bit about Bitstamp. Bitstamp is the oldest running crypto exchange right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, let's put it this way. There's a very small handful of exchanges who could plausibly say that. Bitstamp puts it up and center. They have a pretty good claim to it. Like I mentioned, Kraken has been in the game for a really long time. Coinbase has actually been in the game for an enormously long time, but Bitstamp can kind of lay some claim to that for sure. I want to make it really clear that like I'm using the classic like historian tool of wiping out big entire things for the sake of like making a narrative that makes sense in limited time. Like there was a ton of stuff. I mean, Bitstamp is a great example. Coinbase is a great example. Kraken is a great example. Poloniex are great examples of there's a huge amount that was being built in those dreary years of 2014, 2015, 2016. And I don't want to diminish them at all by kind of not having a name for that phase. I just think that in some ways it was, again, looking at these really big broad brushstrokes patterns, there was this fallout from GOX that was really only starting to pick up, I think, in 2016, 2017. Ryan Selkis was maybe the first person. Obviously, Ryan worked CoinDesk for a long time. He was at DCG. He runs Masari now. And he broke the story in some ways of GOX. So on his 2-Bit Idiot Tumblr on February 24th, 2014, he wrote, I have received an unverified report from an otherwise reliable source, which is purportedly from Mt. Gox. The document, which is titled Crisis Strategy Draft, outlines the current situation at the exchange. I trust the authenticity, but have work to do to verify the document 100% by myself. I will do so feverishly. And then it goes through the whole thing, and the introduction to this document is insane. This is one of the quotes. At the risk of appearing hyperbolic, this could be the end of Bitcoin, at least for most of the public. So, and then Ryan ends on, this is catastrophic and I'm sorry to share this. I do believe that this is one of the existential threats to Bitcoin that many have feared, and have personally sold all of my Bitcoin holdings through Coinbase. To do so and not give you the same information would be dishonest and immoral. I'm a risk-tolerant investor, but I believe this will be catastrophic for Bitcoin, both as a currency and as a fledgling industry. If this is a hoax, it is one I am fully blindsided by. I fear, however, that it is not. And he got shit for this big time for the next week or so before it actually proved to be true. It was bleak, man. Like it was really dreary. I mean, I remember even in, I wasn't in the industry, but you could feel it palpably in San Francisco, just the wave of shudder. And for people who were only watching casually, this is what it sounded like. It did seem like apocalyptic.
Well, that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Nathaniel Whittemore. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I want to mention that since we've started producing episodes at a much higher rate, we now have room for a few more sponsors. If you like the work we do and you would like to support this show, then a sponsorship might be a good fit for you. And I can say from our own experience that flippening sponsorships work. Each and every time we put out an episode of this podcast, we mention our own API. And to date, every single one of these advertisements has resulted in at least one customer. In fact, we would do these shows even if nobody else sponsored because of the business it brings to us. And over 80% of paying customers mention that they heard of us through our podcast. If you're interested in sponsoring the show, please hit us up at support@nomics.com. Okay, that wraps up things for this week. Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Nathaniel Whittemore, which will be released next week. Until then, take care. That's it for this week. To sign up for our free crypto investing newsletter, listen to other episodes, or get the show notes from this episode, please visit flippening.com. I also invite you to check out the startup that funds this podcast, Nomics, spelled Nomics, at nomics.com. Finally, if you got value from the show, the biggest thing you can do to help us out is to leave a 5-star review with some comments and feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.